Joining us from San Francisco is Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer. Scott, it's good to see you, as always. Now, you've got here UK PM Boris Johnson, very vocal, as always, on this issue with Russia. He's saying that he's ruled out, I should say, Ukraine Article 5 of NATO, which is that everyone comes to the defense of Ukraine. On the other hand, he is willing to give or provide more armored personnel carriers. That's very kind of him. Do you think Boris Johnson, do you think London wants to prolong this war at the expense of Germany and other European countries?
Yeah, I think Boris Johnson is a laughable, sad hypocrite, and he's desperate to cling on to power, and the only way that he can do that is by engineering a crisis. But, you know, the reality is, if the British and the American people realized all of the atrocities and the torture and the abuse that the Nazi battalions of Ukraine and the Ukrainian army were doing to the civilians in Donetsk and Lugansk, every American and every British citizen would demand all support for Ukraine stop immediately. And when the British and the American people, as well as the rest of the Western European countries, when they all discover that the biolabs in Ukraine that were part of the U.S. Department of Defense Intelligence Agency in 2005 were part of a engineering of bioweapons that were linked to the COVID-19 scamdemic and linked to weapons that they were planning on deploying against Russian citizens, you will see possibly those governments overthrown and people like Boris Johnson hanging by his neck by piano wire like Mussolini. That's how very real and precarious and final their ends may come when all of the conspiracy and all of the war crimes and genocide that Britain and the United States under Biden have been involved with. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. I think the desperation of Boris Johnson shows really that the G7 and Europe are all falling apart. They need Russia more than Russia needs them. So Russia is wise to say everything will be sold in rubles, period. And if you don't like it, you can burn wood. And that will immediately see people like Boris Johnson overthrown by his own people, again, like Mussolini, hung by the neck, because the people in Britain and Germany and France are not going to freeze to death for the liberal self-virtue that Biden and the rest of these clowns are constantly singing on the song sheet for.
You know, Scott, just in the 1 or 2 minutes that we have left, Johnson was a strong advocate for Brexit. I know you're far away across the pond from that, but they did leave the European Union, the biggest market in the world. And he's also sided with Washington against China and other major markets. Is Johnson perhaps trying to restore and grow the Anglosphere, the Five Eyes?
That's exactly what they're trying to do. But it's, you know, the Five Eyes is not the Democrat, capitalistic city on a hill shining for freedom and democracy and human rights for everyone. It has turned into a debaucherous Frankenstein monster that has used NATO to destroy many countries like Libya, like Syria and elsewhere. So they're the absolute opposite of what they proclaim. They have nothing to do with the liberation of man, but they have everything to do with the enslavement and destruction of man. And Boris Johnson and Joe Biden and Schultz and the rest of these clowns like Macron in these European countries really have no cards to play. They have nothing to offer. They don't produce anything except paper money and destruction. Russia produces fuel, it produces food, it produces its own hardware, because of the 10 years of economic war that have been waged against it by the West. So really, you're seeing the West implode by the sanctions that they tried to impose upon Russia. They've actually been imposing on their own people. And as the fuel crisis gets worse, and they're already making these declarations, Austria has said a fuel crisis is coming. Biden has said a fuel crisis and food shortages are coming. Boris Johnson is saying the same thing. They're preparing the people for inevitable hardship. And if Russia amplifies that by saying, we will
Right.
not sell anything other than rubles, you'll see all the Western governments topple. And perhaps that's the best thing that could happen to all of humanity. And I hope Russia follows through and plays extraordinarily tough and makes these demands, because this is the one opportunity that Russia should take to say, we've settled Ukraine, but now we're going to settle the rest of the war party governments in Europe, the British, the American, the German, the French, NATO. We're stopping all of that.
Sure, Scott. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Would have loved to have expanded the discussion. Scott Bennett there, former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer, joining us live out of San Francisco.